I sent the hymn at the third watch because that is when the Veth'an send it, not because I expected an answer. There is no answer to a death hymn. That is, in some sense, the entire point of one. The sector watchtower at passage marker 9 is not a military installation. It is not even a well-funded civilian one. It is 3 connected modules bolted to a rock that barely qualifies as a moon, a relay hub, a life support sleeve, and an observation blister with a cracked gasket that I had been submitting repair requests about for 11 months. The blister looked out over the debris field we called the margin, which is a kind word for what it actually was. The compressed and slowly tumbling wreckage of the Veth'an trade convoy that had transited this approach lane 40 years before I was assigned here, destroyed by a Kuur interdiction vessel that had since been demilitarized under a treaty that the Kuur had honored until they didn't. My name is Osren. I am a comms attendant, 3rd grade, employed by the Veth'an Passage Authority. My duties, as written in the charter, were to log transit signals, maintain the relay equipment, forward priority traffic to the regional hub, and keep the life support systems from failing. What my duties did not include, and what the charter had no section for, was what to do when a Kuur interdiction group transited the margin at combat speed and began systematically destroying every transponder buoy between marker 9 and open space. I should explain, before I explain the rest, what marker 9 actually was. A relay station has a hierarchy of importance that is not always obvious from the outside. There are stations that handle thousands of transit logs per day and employ dozens of operators and sit at the junctions of multiple active trade routes. Then there are stations like marker 9, which handle perhaps 12 logs per month in a good stretch, employ one operator, me, and sit at the mouth of an approach lane that has been declining in traffic for the last decade as the Kuur tension has made the corridor increasingly unprofitable for commercial transit. Marker 9's value to the Passage Authority was that it maintained the relay chain at the far end of the lane and kept the nav buoys operational. It was the kind of station that appears in budgets as a line item rather than as a named asset. I had applied for reassignment twice. Both applications had been filed, acknowledged, and apparently set on a shelf somewhere in the Passage Authority's administrative structure to age quietly. In the meantime, I maintained the equipment, filed the logs, submitted the repair requests that were filed and acknowledged and set on the same shelf, and looked out through the observation blister at the debris of the old convoy and thought about things that have no productive answers. I had been at marker 9 for 9 years when the Kuur came. I watched them do it for 2 hours before I understood what I was watching. The first buoy went dark at the beginning of the second watch. I logged it as equipment failure. Buoys in the margin fail with some regularity, struck by debris, or simply worn out from the radiation environment. The second buoy went dark 11 minutes later, and I filed a second log entry, still under equipment failure, because I am thorough and because I did not want to reach for the other explanation. The third, fourth, and fifth buoys went dark in a sequence so regular it could only have been deliberate, and I sat in front of the relay console and looked at the pattern on the screen for a long time. There are moments when you understand something and also understand that understanding it changes the nature of your situation in ways that are not reversible. This was one of those moments. The 5 dark buoys on my display were not a malfunction. They were a message. They were the message that someone was removing the infrastructure that connected me to the rest of the lane, and they were doing it deliberately and without any communication that might give me the opportunity to ask them to stop. I pulled up the passive sensor array, which is not a combat sensor array, which is barely a sensor array at all, which is the kind of thing the Passage Authority budgets for a civilian relay station in a low-traffic corridor, and I looked at what was moving through the margin. There were 7 of them, Kuur interdiction hulls, the heavier class, the ones that carry point suppression weapons in addition to their breach cutters. They were moving in a dispersed formation across the approach lane, which is the formation you use when you are not approaching a target but are instead closing off a corridor. They were not moving toward marker 9. They were moving around it. They were sealing the lane in both directions, and they were doing it without broadcasting any identification, any intent, or any communication whatsoever. The Kuur are not a chatty species, but they talk to installations they intend to negotiate with. They don't talk to installations they intend to isolate. I sat with that understanding for a while. The life support system hummed. The relay console blinked with the ongoing absence of the buoys I could no longer reach. Outside, through the blister with the cracked gasket, the debris of the old convoy turned slowly in the dark. I had looked at that debris for 9 years, and it had never looked like anything in particular to me. It was simply the landscape of Marker 9, the thing that was always in the background. In that moment it looked like a warning that had not, until now, been addressed to me. I tried the regional hub on 3 separate frequencies: standard protocol, priority 1, priority 2, priority 3. The hub did not respond, which meant either the hub's relay chain had already been cut, which the 5 dark buoys suggested it had been, or the Kuur were suppressing outbound traffic from the Marker 9 sector entirely. I tried the emergency channel on the Veth'an military band, the one reserved for exactly this kind of situation. I received a carrier tone and nothing else, which in signal terms is the equivalent of a door that has been locked from the other side. I tried 2 coalition auxiliary channels I was not technically authorized to use, but that I had the access codes for because a previous operator at Marker 9 had left them in the equipment manual, and those returned nothing at all, not even a carrier tone. I was, by any practical measure, alone. I want to be clear about what that word means in this context. I do not mean alone in the sense of no company, which I was accustomed to. I mean alone in the sense of disconnected from any infrastructure that might hear me, might respond to me, might know that I existed. The Passage Authority had no way of knowing that Marker 9 was under any pressure because the relay chain through which they would have learned it was gone. The Veth'an military had no way of knowing because the emergency channel was silent on my end, and I had no way of knowing whether anything was getting through on theirs. The coalition channels gave me nothing. 7 Kuur interdiction hulls in the margin, and me, and a relay station that was no longer connected to anything, and the debris of the old convoy turning slowly outside the window. I am not a soldier. I want to be clear about that because it matters to what I did next. A soldier in my position would have done a threat assessment, would have begun thinking about defensive options, would have activated whatever emergency protocols applied to a military installation under interdiction. Marker 9 had no defensive options. The closest thing it had to armament was a pressurized cargo release system that was designed to push supply crates away from the docking collar and could, in a very charitable reading, be described as a projectile delivery mechanism. The emergency protocol for a civilian relay station under interdiction consists of 4 steps. Step 1. Attempt communication on all available channels. Step 2. If communication fails, attempt to reach an adjacent station or installation. Step 3. If that fails, use any available relay infrastructure to broadcast a general distress signal on standard emergency frequencies. Step 4. If all previous steps have failed, the attending operator should document the situation as completely as possible and await further instruction. I had completed steps 1 through 3 in roughly 45 minutes. The standard emergency frequency returned the same carrier tone as everything else, which told me the suppression field was covering it. I documented the situation. I logged the buoy failures with their timestamps. I logged my sensor readings of the 7 Kuur hulls and their formation and their heading. I logged my failed communication attempts on each frequency with their response codes. I wrote a summary of my assessment in plain language, which is something the Charter does not technically require but which seemed appropriate, and which gave me something to do with my hands and my attention while the implications of step 4 settled into place. Then I sat in front of the console and looked at the screen and thought about the 4th step and what it meant to await further instruction when there was no one left to instruct me. The answer, I decided after a while, was that it meant nothing. The charter was written for situations that differed from this one in a key respect. In every situation the charter anticipated, there was still someone who might eventually provide instruction. A delayed relay chain, a slow military response, a communication blackout with a defined end. Step 4 was the step for when you had done everything you could and needed to wait for the larger system to catch up to your situation. The larger system, in my situation, did not know my situation existed. I sat for a while longer. The cooler hulls continued their slow work in the margin. The relay console continued to blink with absences. I went to the ration stores and retrieved something to eat, because I was not hungry, but I was aware that I might need the function later, and it was a thing I could control, unlike almost everything else. Then I went to the cultural archive. The Veth'an death hymn is not technically a religious document. It is a cultural one. The distinction matters to certain scholars and not at all to anyone actually dying, but I mention it because the hymn has a complicated relationship with the concept of prayer. It is sung, or broadcast, in the modern practice, on what we call the chapel band frequency, which is a very old designation for a carrier wave that predates the current communications architecture by several hundred years. In the early period of Veth'an expansion, when ships traveled routes that took months and casualties were common, the chapel band was the frequency set aside for exactly this kind of transmission. Not tactical, not commercial, not emergency in the procedural sense, but emergency in the human sense, as I would come to understand that phrase. The frequency for the things you say when you have nothing left to say to anyone who can help. The hymn is 12 verses. The first 3 are addressed to the ancestors, asking them to hold a place. The middle 6 are addressed to whoever might be listening, not any specific deity or authority, just whoever, asking them to note that the singer existed and mattered and tried. The final 3 are addressed to no one, which is perhaps the most honest section of any hymn I have encountered, and which I have always found, even in ordinary circumstances, to be the most difficult to hear. The recording in the cultural archive was made by the Veth'an Passage Chorus 40 years ago, 3 months before the Kuur destroyed the convoy in the margin. I do not know whether the chorus knew, when they made the recording, what was coming for the convoy. I do not know whether the recording is why the archive has not been updated in several years, or whether that is simply the Passage Authority's general approach to archival maintenance. I know that it is the version of the hymn in the archive, and that when I selected it and routed it to the transmitter, I was not thinking about any of that. I was thinking about the 4th step and what followed the 4th step when there was no further instruction. I did not sing it. I do not have the voice for it, and there was no one present to appreciate the attempt. I played the recorded version, and I broadcast it on the chapel band frequency at full relay power, which at marker 9 is not an impressive figure, but is all I had. I want to be precise about my intentions when I did this. I was not sending a distress call. I did not frame it as one. I did not attach any header identifying myself or my situation or what was happening to the approach lane. I simply played the hymn on the chapel band and let it go where it went, which I expected to be nowhere, because the Kuur were suppressing the active channels, and the chapel band is not an active channel, technically speaking, and is not in any standard suppression protocol I was aware of. I was not certain the signal was even getting out. I did not have any means to confirm it. I played the hymn because it was the thing you play when you have nothing left to say to anyone who can help, and because the middle 6 verses contain a request to whoever might be listening, and the asking seemed, in that moment, important even without any prospect of an answer. It was getting out. The chapel band frequency is very old, and the core interdiction protocols were written against the current communications architecture, not against carrier waves that predated it by several centuries. The hymn went through a gap in the suppression field, the way water goes through a crack, not because anyone planned it, not because I had any tactical sophistication in choosing the frequency, but because the crack was there and the water had nowhere else to go. This is the kind of luck that does not feel like luck when it is happening, because you are not aware that you need it, and you do not know it has occurred until much later. I did not know this at the time. I played the hymn, and I sat back, and I watched the 7 Coor hulls continue their slow work of sealing the lane. They made no move toward Marker 9 for another 4 hours. I do not know what they were doing during that time, building up to something perhaps, or waiting for a confirmation signal from wherever their orders originated, or simply being patient in the way that something large and deliberate is patient. The Coor are not, in my experience of them through transit logs and trade correspondence, an impulsive species. They had sealed the corridor. I was not going anywhere. They could afford to let the 4th step run its course. I spent those 4 hours doing the things you do when you have already done the necessary things and have nothing else to do. I checked the life support systems twice and found them adequate. I reviewed the logs, found them accurate, and made some small formatting improvements that I was aware, even as I made them, were not necessary. I went to the observation blister and sat in the chair that faced the margin and looked at the debris of the old convoy turning in the dark. I thought about the passage chorus and their recording, and the 3 months between the recording and the convoy's destruction. I thought about whether they had known. I thought about what you do with the knowledge that something is coming that you cannot stop, whether you document it or whether you do something else, whether the documentation is for the record or for yourself. I thought about the mechanics of the hymn, which is not a thing I had thought about before because the hymn had always been to me a cultural artifact rather than a practice, something you knew the shape of but had never used. The 12 verses, the 3-part structure, ancestors, whoever might be listening, no one seem, when you consider them as engineering rather than culture, to be quite deliberately designed for a situation like the one I was in. The first section is for the people you know, the connection you have some reasonable expectation of reaching. The last section is for the honesty of your situation, the acknowledgement that the connection may not reach anything at all. But the middle section, the 6 verses for whoever might be listening, is the section that represents the option between those two. It is the section that says, I do not know who you are, I do not know if you are there, but I am making the transmission anyway, because the alternative to transmitting is silence, and silence is its own kind of decision. The people who wrote the hymn understood this, I think. They had lived in enough silence to know what it cost. I had chosen not to be silent. I was not certain, even then, that it was a decision rather than a reflex. The way you call out in a dark corridor, not because you expect an answer, but because the calling is what the situation demands. But I had done it, and the hymn was out there, and the Coor suppression field was doing whatever it was doing to every other frequency I had tried, and the chapel band carrier was either getting through or it wasn't, and there was nothing more I could do about any of it. I thought also about the 4 Veth'an operators who had preceded me at Marker 9. One of them had left the coalition channel access codes in the equipment manual. One of them had installed an additional passive sensor sweep that was not in the standard configuration, which was the sensor that had given me the clearest readings of the Coor formation. None of them, as far as I could tell from the records, had ever faced anything like this. They had logged their transit signals and submitted their repair requests and eventually been reassigned or retired. And they had left small traces in the equipment and the documentation that had been useful to me today in ways they could not have anticipated. I found this, for reasons I could not fully articulate, to be a comfort. It was on the 5th hour that the sensor array registered a new contact. I almost did not check it. The passive array was not reliable in the standard sense of reliable, and I had been watching false returns on it for most of the day, small debris fragments appearing briefly as heat signatures before tumbling out of the array's effective range. But the return was steady, which debris returns are not, and it was not moving on a debris trajectory. It was moving on a transit-exit vector, which is the specific vector a ship takes when it drops out of faster-than-light travel into a system. A controlled deceleration on a heading that only a navigated object produces. I pulled up the contact display and watched it for 3 minutes before I accepted that what I was seeing was real. The ship was smaller than any of the Kuar interdiction hulls, considerably smaller by my array's rough estimation, perhaps a third of the mass of the lightest Kuar vessel in the formation. It was not moving on an approach vector toward marker 9. It was moving on a vector that would take it directly to the edge of the margin, to the position where the outermost Kuar hull sat in the slow work of maintaining the interdiction. I did not recognize the hull configuration. I had worked relay stations in this corridor for 9 years, and before that I had done 3 years at a junction station that handled considerably more traffic. I had logged the transit signatures of Veth'an ships across a dozen classes, Kuar commercial and military vessels, coalition cargo haulers in 4 different hull families, sector authority patrol classes, a directorate courier, and 1 vessel whose classification I was never given a satisfying answer about, and which I still think about occasionally. I knew the silhouette of every common hull type in this part of the galaxy by their sensor shadow. The ship on my array did not match any of them. It was a wedge shape, low and broad, with a drive signature that produced a heat bloom on my passive array unlike anything I had calibrated against. The bloom was disproportionately large for the hull, which is what you get when a ship has been fitted with a drive system designed for a vessel significantly larger than itself, or when a ship has been modified so extensively from its original configuration that the standard heat signature tables no longer apply. The ship's profile was compact, and to my eye, understated in the way that something understated when function has taken complete precedence over form. The ship went directly at the outermost Kuar hull and did not slow down. I pressed myself against the console. I am not proud of this reflex, but it was honest, and I have committed to being accurate in this account. The Kuar hull reacted. I could see its drive bloom change as it maneuvered to meet the contact, could see the point suppression weapons come live on my passive array, because weapons lock puts out an electromagnetic signature you can read even with equipment as modest as mine. Whatever the approaching ship was, the Kuar vessel had decided it was a threat, which told me that the approaching ship had done something to make that determination straightforward. What followed on my sensor array was not, I want to be clear, something I was well equipped to observe. A passive array at a civilian relay station is not designed to track combat engagements. It can tell you that ships are present and moving, can give you rough mass and drive signature readings, can detect weapons lock and the broad electromagnetic signatures of certain weapon types. It cannot give you a precise account of an engagement between vessels with active electronic warfare, maneuvering under combat power, at ranges that push the limits of its resolution. What I could tell was this. The small ship and the outermost Kuar hull engaged at close range, and the engagement was short, and at the end of it the Kuar hull's drive signature shifted from combat active to minimum power in a period of time that was, by any standard I could apply, remarkably brief. A Kuar interdiction hull of that class does not go from combat active to minimum power quickly, unless it is no longer capable of making other choices. The unknown ship turned toward the next Kuar hull in the formation. I watched it work. That is the only word I found for it then, and the only word I find for it now. Work. It was not dramatic in the way that combat is supposed to be dramatic. The small vessel moved through the formation with a kind of deliberate economy, doing each thing in sequence the way you do when you have a procedure and you are following it. Not hurrying, but not pausing. The second Kuar hull lasted longer than the first. It had more warning and had time to bring its suppression weapons to active status before the contact arrived. The third lasted longer still. The unknown ship took damage in the engagement with the third. I could read the drive's signature stutter on my array, a brief irregularity that resolved back into steady output. But it did not stop. It took the ship a little over an hour to work through all 7 Kuur vessels. At the end of that hour, 6 Kuur hulls were dead in space or had already begun the slow drift toward the debris field, and the 7th was broadcasting a standard emergency locator signal on the Coalition distress channel, which is what a ship broadcasts when it has decided that broadcasting its location to anyone who might help is preferable to the alternative. The unknown vessel accepted this, or at least interpreted it correctly. It disengaged from the 7th hull without destroying it, and then it held position at the edge of the margin. Then its lights came on. Not its running lights. Its full exterior lighting array, every position indicator and work lamp and docking guide on the hull's exterior surface, all at once. I had been in this corridor for 9 years. I had processed the transit records of hundreds of vessels. I had never seen a ship do that after a combat action. The standard Veth'an military procedure after an engagement is minimum signature, reduce your profile, reduce your electromagnetic output, make yourself as difficult to find as possible until the tactical picture is clear. Turning on every exterior light you carry is not only the opposite of that, it is conspicuously, almost defiantly the opposite of that. It is the posture of a ship that has decided it does not need to hide, and more than that, it is the posture of a ship that wants to be found by someone specific. Someone it knows is somewhere in the dark trying to figure out what is happening, and this is the clearest signal it can think to send. I am here. I am not one of them. If there is anyone alive in that station, this is where you look. I opened the communications console and looked at the frequency selector for a long time. The ship was not broadcasting on any Veth'an military frequency. It was not broadcasting on Coalition channels. It was broadcasting on a carrier wave that I recognized, after I pulled up the archive and checked, because I wanted to be certain, as the chapel band frequency. The same carrier wave I had used 3 hours earlier to broadcast the death hymn. It had answered on the chapel band. I am a comms attendant, 3rd grade. Part of my training 9 years ago covered the basics of interspecies communication protocols, not in the depth of a diplomat or a contact specialist, but enough to manage standard transit communications in 6 languages, and enough to know which species used which emergency channels and why. I went through that training material in my head, standing at the console trying to place the frequency usage, the hull configuration, the drive signature, the pattern of what I had just watched. The chapel band frequency is not only a Veth'an designation. It is a designation used independently by several species in this region of space for functionally similar purposes. The frequency set aside for the things you say when you have nothing useful left to say. In most cases, each species maintains its own chapel band in isolation, tuned to its own cultural frequencies, received by its own kind. There is one species, however, that had taken a different approach. That species had decided, at some point in its institutional history, that maintaining separate monitoring for each alien chapel band was inefficient, and that the better architecture was a single monitoring system that listened to all of them, across all known species, because any signal on any chapel band in any language was worth treating as potentially distress-related until proven otherwise. The logic, as I would later have it explained to me, was simple. The cost of monitoring a signal that turns out to be purely cultural is low. The cost of not monitoring a signal that turns out to be someone's last transmission is not recoverable. I keyed the transmitter. My hands were not entirely steady, which is also an accurate thing to report. This is Osren, comms attendant 3rd grade, Veth'an Passage Authority, Sector Watchtower Marker 9. I stopped and started again. I think you may have received a signal that I did not intend as a standard emergency communication. The signal I sent was a Veth'an death hymn on the chapel band frequency. I did not expect a response. I did not aim it at. I stopped. I had been about to say, I did not aim it at anyone in particular. But that was not quite right, because I had aimed it at the ancestors and at whoever might be listening, and at no one, which are three distinct recipients, none of which are a military asset in a supply corridor. The hymn's middle verses are for whoever might be listening. I had simply not expected whoever to be a category that contained a practical answer. The channel held for a moment. Then a voice came back, flat, procedural, with the slight cadence irregularity that a real-time translation processor introduces when it is working across languages that do not share rhythm, and said, "Station Marker 9, this is the ECV returned favor. We logged your signal approximately 3 hours and 14 minutes ago via the Sector 14 relay. Are you secured?" I looked at my console. I looked at the sensor returns from the 6 dead Cougar hulls and the one still transmitting its locator signal. I looked out through the observation blister, the cracked gasket, the view beyond at the exterior lighting array of the ECV returned favor blazing at the edge of the margin. "Yes," I said, "I think so." "Copy," the voice said. "Stand by for approach." That was all. The channel clicked and I heard the open carrier, and the returned favor's drive signature changed, and it began moving toward Marker 9. I sat down on the floor of the relay module. I am not particularly proud of this, but my legs had made a decision I had not been consulted about, and arguing with them seemed like an inefficient use of resources at that moment. I sat on the floor and looked at the blinking of the relay console and the steady bloom of the returned favor's drive on my passive array, getting larger, and I thought about the middle 6 verses and whoever might be listening. Someone had been listening, someone had come. The returned favor was a human vessel. I confirmed this with reasonable certainty when the ship matched station with the docking collar at Marker 9's outer hub, and I watched, through the porthole in the collar's vestibule, a human crew member in a pressure suit cycling through the outer airlock and beginning the manual attachment sequence for the docking clamps. The collar's automated system had stopped working 2 years before I arrived and had been on the repair request list since then, which is to say it was on the same shelf as the gasket request and the life support Sector 3 request, and was not likely to arrive in any meaningful time frame. The crew member attached the clamps with an efficiency that suggested familiarity with manual docking procedures that automated systems had failed to replace, and then the inner airlock cycled, and a human being came through into the relay module. I had seen humans before, in the transit context, and I had processed the documentation of human vessels and crews with reasonable frequency over my 9 years at corridor stations. Humans are one of those species that is more common in documentation than in person in certain parts of the galaxy, because their presence concentrates in the corridors that serve their own trade routes and becomes sparse in the corridors that don't. Marker 9's corridor was one that didn't. I knew what humans were. I had never spoken at length to one. She was in a pressure suit, helmet unsealed but not removed, carrying a kit bag over one shoulder and a hand scanner in the other. She came through the airlock and stopped and swept the scanner across the relay module with the rapid, systematic attention of someone doing a first assessment of an unfamiliar space. Not cautiously, not slowly, but efficiently, the way you look at a situation when you have limited time and need a complete picture. "Osren," she said. "Yes." "Captain Aldine." She had started moving toward the main console, scanner still running. "Your life support is reading amber on Sector 3. Were you aware?" "Yes, I have been submitting repair requests about that system for 8 months." She made a small sound, not quite dismissive, not quite sympathetic. "It's not at critical threshold yet. The margins are adequate. We'll do a field fix before we leave." She set the kit bag down and looked at me directly, a measuring look, not unfriendly, the look of someone taking stock of whether the person in front of them is intact. "You understand what the returned favor is?" "A human vessel," I said. I arrived at that conclusion from the hull configuration and the frequency usage. "Earth courier variant," she said. "Supply runner. Some modifications." She said this in the precise, neutral tone of someone reciting a classification from an official document, and the specific neutrality with which she said the last two words made me think the modifications were more significant than the words suggested, and that she was accustomed to describing them this way. "We were running a transfer to the Sector 14 depot when the relay forwarded your signal. The depot can wait." "You came from Sector 14, I said. 3 hours and change." "The relay forwarded the death hymn." "The relay forwarded a chapel band carrier with a Veth'an cultural signature," she said, pulling out the scanner again and beginning a second sweep of the communications array. "Our monitoring protocol flags chapel band transmissions as distress adjacent regardless of content encoding until a human operator can determine otherwise. We couldn't determine otherwise from a recorded relay position, so we came to determine otherwise in person." She paused on a reading. "What exactly did you transmit?" The relay packet included what looked like a cultural archive file. "It was a Veth'an death hymn," I said, "a ritual farewell, the thing you broadcast when you believe you will die and you want the ancestors to know you are coming. The middle verses address whoever might be listening." I stopped. Then, I did not aim the transmission at Earth. I did not aim it at any particular recipient. I did not know that Earth's relay would receive it. I did not know your protocols would treat it as. "I understand," she said. She said it without cutting me off, which is a distinction. She waited until I had finished, and then she said it, and she said it in the way you say it when the understanding is actual rather than procedural. "You thought you were saying goodbye." "Yes." She looked at the porthole, at the far edge of the margin, at the shapes of the 6 Kuer hulls beginning their slow drift. "You almost were," she said. It was not a judgment. It was simply true, and she said it the way you say true things when they do not require embellishment. She put the scanner away and picked up the kit bag. "I'm going to fix Sector 3. Then we need to talk about your communication options, because your relay chain is cut at 4 points by my count, and you're going to be isolated until the authority dispatches a repair crew. I can expedite that if you give me your priority contact codes." She was already at the doorway to the life support sleeve. "Anything else about this station I should know before I start poking around?" "The observation blister has a cracked gasket," I said. "I have been submitting repair requests for 11 months. A pause at the doorway. "I'll add it to the list," she said in the same procedural tone. I followed her into the life support sleeve because I found that I did not want to be alone in the relay module, which was new information about myself. 9 years at isolated stations, and I had been comfortable in the isolation in the way that a thing that is always present stops being noticed. The isolation I had lived inside for the past several hours was a different order of alone, and the sounds of another person moving through the module with purpose and competence were a thing I had not been aware I needed until they were present. She talked while she worked. Not continuously, she was not, I was beginning to understand, someone who filled silence for its own sake, but in the intervals between tasks, when her hands were occupied with something that did not require her full attention. She told me without being asked that the returned favor had taken damage in the engagement, forward port dorsal, she said, which was the section of the hull I had seen take the heaviest return fire from the 3rd Kuer vessel. "Nothing we can't patch in a few hours," she said. "The drive stutter you would have read on your array was a power coupling issue, not structural. It's been logged." She said this last part in the tone of someone who logs things as a reflex, as a practice that does not require a decision each time. She told me about the Sector 14 relay and its monitoring protocol. The relay was a joint installation, human and coalition, and the human component ran the chapel band monitoring system that had flagged my transmission. The coalition component, she said, found the monitoring protocol excessive. They don't maintain chapel band awareness across species, she said. Their position is that each species chapel band is that species' concern, and cross-species monitoring is an intrusion into cultural communication space. A pause while she replaced a component in the life support panel. Our position is that the cost of monitoring something you don't end up needing is lower than the cost of not monitoring something you do. I thought about this. How often does the monitoring result in a response? More than they think, she said, less than we'd like. She told me she had been on the returned favor for 11 years. She had run supply and courier contracts in this corridor before the current tension with the courier changed the traffic patterns, back when the approach lane was open, and the margin was simply a named feature in the nav charts rather than the effective boundary of a contested zone. She had known some of the operators at the approach lane stations, she said, from before. She stopped herself there and went back to the panel, and I did not ask her to continue. There are some things you do not push on, and the way she stopped was a clear indication that this was one of them. I thought about the convoy wreckage in the margin. I thought about the recording in the archive, the passage chorus, 40 years ago, 3 months before the convoy. I thought about the fact that the version of the hymn I had transmitted was their version, because the archive had not been updated and their version was the one that was in it. I thought about whether she had known any of the people on those ships and decided I would not ask. The recording, I said instead. The hymn I broadcast, it was made 40 years ago, by a choir that was assigned to this approach lane route, before. The archive date was in the relay packet, she said, not looking up from the panel. I know. A silence. Old frequencies, she said, old recordings. Things that should have gone quiet a long time ago still making noise. She closed the life support panel and checked the status readout. Sector 3 is green. She stood and looked at me. The Kuar formation, she said, as if we were mid-conversation on a topic we had already begun. 7 vessels. 6 disabled, 1 surrendered, I said. Yes. The returned favor is classified as a supply runner. With some modifications, I said. I used her phrasing, the same neutral tone. Something in her expression shifted. Not quite a smile, not quite something else. 7 Kuar interdiction hulls, she said, in a sealed corridor. Alone, I said. She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked at the porthole, at the exterior lights of the returned favor visible through it, blazing in the dark outside marker 9. We were the closest available asset, she said. It was not a boast. It was not a deflection. It was the statement of a logistical fact, said in the tone of someone who has stopped finding that fact remarkable because it has been true too many times in too many places to sustain surprise. Someone needed to be there. We were there. I considered that. I considered the relay monitoring protocol and the chapel band gap in the Kuar suppression field, and a supply runner with some modifications diverting from a depot run, because an automated system on a joint relay station flagged a 40-year-old cultural archive file as distress adjacent. I considered the specific chain of small decisions and outdated frequencies and logged protocols that had to have been in exactly the right configuration for the returned favor to be here at all. You came because of the hymn, I said. We came because of the signal, she said. The hymn is yours, we don't, she paused, choosing words. We logged the carrier. The carrier indicated a possible distress situation that we could not resolve from a distance. We resolved it in person, that's the protocol. She picked up her kit bag. That's all it is. I did not say anything else. Adding to it would have made it smaller somehow. There is a kind of statement that is exactly the right size and diminishes when you add to it, and I could feel the edges of that one. She moved toward the corridor that connected the relay hub to the outer collar. I'm going to check the collar and coordinate with my crew on the hull repairs. Your relay chain workaround. I'll have my comms officer set it up using the returned favors equipment. It will keep you connected to the regional hub until the repair crew arrives. I've already sent the incident report to 3 separate authority and military channels. Someone will be out here within a few days. Thank you, I said. She paused at the corridor entrance. You did the right thing, she said. I looked at her. I played a death hymn on an obsolete frequency. I did not do anything deliberate. You used what you had, she said. The channel was open, the frequency was clear. You put a signal out on the one frequency nobody was suppressing, and you asked whoever might be listening to hear you. She met my eyes for a moment. That counts. Then she went to work on the collar, and I went back to my console, and I sat for a while with the quiet that is different from the quiet that preceded it. She spent 4 hours at Marker 9 in total. Her crew, 3 of them, in addition to herself, handled the hull repairs to the returned favor, and while they were at it, attended to several things about Marker 9 that I had not requested and had not anticipated. I watched them work to the extent my tasks allowed. They moved through the station with the efficient attention of people who have assessed unfamiliar spaces many times and have learned to see what is actually there rather than what they expected to find. The crew member with precise movements found the docking collar's secondary clamp mechanism had been installed incorrectly and corrected it, explaining the fault to me in careful terms in case it became relevant later. He then checked the primary clamp mechanism, found it within tolerance but marginal, and adjusted it to center without comment. I only confirmed he had done it from the collar's status display afterward. Another crew member recalibrated the passive sensor array, which had been running below its design sensitivity because of a firmware issue. The array's software had not been updated in several years and was calibrated for a different installation environment. The corrected array showed me the returned favor's hull in considerably more detail than I had previously resolved, and the Kua wreckage with a clarity that had no practical relevance but that felt significant in a way I could not easily name. I could see, now, the full extent of the forward port dorsal damage, and I understood better what it meant that the ship had continued through the engagement anyway. The third crew member, handling communications, set up the relay bridge using equipment from the returned favor, tested it on all my priority channels, and left me a written guide to maintaining the configuration until the repair crew arrived, formatted in numbered steps that assumed competence but not familiarity, with annotated notes at the end explaining certain choices in the architecture. Aldine gave me the authority and military contact codes that would expedite the repair crew dispatch. She reviewed the incident report I had filed and suggested 3 additions to the factual record that I agreed were accurate and incorporated. She walked the returned favors doctor. There was a doctor on a supply runner, which I noted and did not comment on, through the station to confirm I was physically unharmed, which I was, and the doctor noted that my stress response indicators were elevated and recommended I eat a full ration and sleep within the next 6 hours, which I thought were reasonable suggestions. Before she left, she stood at the outer airlock in her pressure suit, helmet in hand, and looked at me for a moment with the measuring expression I had first seen when she came through the airlock and assessed the relay module. "The observation blister gasket," she said. "Yes. Fixed. My crew did it about an hour ago. It was a straightforward replacement. The part was in our general repair supplies." She said it in the same procedural tone she used for everything. "I have been submitting requests for that for 11 months, I said. "I know," a pause. "The authorities' queue is longer than it should be. That's a different problem." She held out her hand, which I recognized as the human gesture of conclusion, the gesture that marks the end of an exchange between people who have conducted themselves appropriately toward one another and are parting on those terms. I extended my hand, and she took it in the brief, specific human way and released it. "Returned favor," I said. "Is that the name of your ship or a statement of intent?" She looked at me for a moment, and then she smiled, a full one, not the partial expression I had seen earlier, and said, "Both, always both." Then the airlock cycled, and she was gone. I filed my incident report that evening, after the returned favor's drive signature had faded from my passive array, and the margin was as quiet as a debris field ever is, which is not very, but quiet enough. The report was thorough. I documented the Kuar formation and its movements, and the timeline of the communications blackout and my own responses, including the decision to broadcast the death hymn on the chapel band frequency, and the complete absence of tactical calculation in that decision. I documented the relay intercept and the ECV returned favor's arrival and the engagement with the Kuar formation. I documented the hull repairs and the collar work and the sensor array recalibration and the relay bridge and the gasket and the list of things that had been done to Marker 9 by a supply runner's crew in 4 hours that had not been done in the preceding 9 years. Then I sat for a while and thought about how to classify the event. The classification field in an authority incident report requires a category code, and the code drives the archive filing, and the archive filing determines who sees the report and in what context. There is a code for Kuar interdiction events. There is a code for communication failures. There is a code for facility damage. There is a code for third-party rescue operations, which came closest, but the definition of a third-party rescue operation specifies that it is an operation in which a third party responds to a distress communication, and I had not transmitted a distress communication. I had transmitted a ritual farewell on a cultural frequency, and the distress component had been inferred by a monitoring system from the carrier wave signature, and the rescue had been dispatched on that inference. I typed in the free text notes field, "Signal transmitted on chapel band frequency, cultural archive format, not coded or intended as emergency communication, intercepted by Earth relay installation via cross-species monitoring protocol, Earth vessel dispatched on distress-adjacent classification, engagement with Kuar interdiction group destroyed or surrendered, station and operator intact. The response was not sought in the procedural sense. The response was given anyway." I looked at that for a while. Then I added, "The middle 6 verses of the Veth'an death hymn are addressed to whoever might be listening. It is possible that this is not a rhetorical convention." I submitted the report. In the classification field I typed, "See notes. No existing code applies. Suggest creating one." I did not expect anyone at the Passage Authority to create one. I expected the report would be reviewed, noted, and filed in whatever category was closest by someone with a queue too long to spend time on edge cases. But I had written the suggestion honestly, because it seemed accurate that what had happened did not fit the existing taxonomy, and accurate observations seemed worth recording even when their practical consequence was unclear. I sat back in the chair and looked at the observation blister. The gasket was sealed now, a clean repair, the view unobstructed for the first time since I had arrived at Marker 9. Outside, the debris of the old convoy turned in the dark as it had always turned, as it would presumably continue to turn for considerably longer than I would be at this station. The 6 Kuar hulls had begun their own slow drift into the margin, which would take months, and eventually they would become part of the debris field too, and someday some future operator at some future relay station would look out and see them and not know what they had been. I thought about classification for a while longer than was probably necessary. The problem with classifying the event was that every available code described something that was almost what had happened but not quite. The code for third-party rescue operations was closest, but its definition assumed that the rescued party had transmitted a distress signal in order to be rescued. I had transmitted a ritual farewell. The monitoring protocol had classified it as distress adjacent. The ship had come on the basis of that classification, not on the basis of my intent. Whether this constituted a rescue in the code sense, or something the code did not have a name for yet, was a question I left for the archive system and whoever would eventually review the report. What I found I could not classify and did not try to was the simpler question of what the transmission had actually been. I had called it a death hymn, and it was. I had told Aldine I had not aimed it at anyone, and that was also accurate. But the middle 6 verses address whoever might be listening, and whatever might be listening is a genuine question about the nature of the universe. And the answer I had received to that question was specific and practical, and had arrived in 3 hours and 14 minutes from a relay station in Sector 14. I did not know how to hold that alongside the cultural framework in which the hymn had always existed, in which whoever might be listening is a theological variable, a gesture toward something the singer cannot name and cannot reach. The returned favor had been reachable. Someone had built a monitoring protocol specifically to make it reachable, to close the gap between the signal and the response, to ensure that the frequency for the things you say when you have nothing left to say to anyone who can help was also a frequency where something that could help was listening. Someone had decided that whatever might be listening was too important a question to leave entirely to theology. I did not have a category code for that. I was not sure one existed in any system I had access to. The chapel band frequency was quiet. Not silent. It is never fully silent, because a frequency that is kept open for transmission has a carrier wave, and the carrier wave is the sound of the frequency being maintained, of someone having decided that this is the channel you leave open because you do not know what you might hear on it or who might need to use it. It was simply quiet the way it is between transmissions. I thought about the middle 6 verses, the ones that ask whoever might be listening to note that the singer existed and mattered and tried. I had sent those verses into a suppression field through a crack that the suppression field's designers had not thought to close, and they had traveled 3 hours to a relay station on a joint installation, and an automated system had logged them and classified them, and passed them to a supply runner with some modifications that was already in transit, and the supply runner had diverted and done what needed to be done and fixed the gasket. Whether that was theology or protocol or simple logistics, I found I was not in a position to say. Perhaps it was all three. Perhaps the distinction between them is less clear than it appears from the inside of any one of them. The frequency was quiet. I picked up my log and began the next entry.